"What rank were you, old man?" The question was meant as a joke. A harmless laugh tossed across a crowded military medical tent on a warm afternoon in North Carolina. But less than 10 seconds later, every conversation stopped. Every medic froze. And one young Marine suddenly wished he had never asked. The GP tent hummed with the familiar rhythm of a busy training exercise. Portable air conditioning units rattled against the canvas walls. Radios crackled with routine updates. The scent of disinfectant mixed with coffee and damp earth drifted through the air. Outside, military trucks rolled across gravel roads while a helicopter passed somewhere in the distance. Inside, dozens of service members moved from station to station as medical staff checked vital signs and processed paperwork. In the middle of it all sat Ethan Walker. Most people barely noticed him. That was nothing new. At 42 years old, Ethan had mastered the art of becoming invisible. His faded work shirt carried no military insignia. His baseball cap was worn from years of use. His posture was relaxed, almost ordinary. To anyone passing by, he looked like another civilian contractor helping support the training operation. Nobody would have guessed he was raising a 12-year-old daughter alone. Nobody would have guessed he woke up before sunrise every morning to make breakfast, drive her to school, and still report to work before most people finish their first cup of coffee. And nobody would have guessed that behind his calm blue eyes lived memories he rarely spoke about. Ethan preferred it that way. Quiet was easier. Quiet allowed him to focus on what mattered. But some days had a strange way of dragging old stories back into the light. Sergeant Mason Reed was the first to notice him that afternoon. Young, confident, and popular among the Marines, Mason had the easy charm of someone who had spent most of his life being admired. He was standing near a folding table surrounded by a few friends when his eyes landed on Ethan. "Hey," Mason called out with a grin. "You military, or just pretending to blend in?" A few nearby Marines laughed. Ethan looked up from the clipboard he was organizing. "Used to be military." "Used to be," Mason repeated. "Well, that explains the posture." More laughter followed. Ethan simply smiled and returned to his paperwork. That should have been the end of it. But curiosity has a way of growing when it meets silence. Mason stepped closer. "Army." Ethan nodded once. "Long time ago." "Officer." Ethan gave a small shrug. "Something like that." Several medics nearby exchanged amused looks. Even Dr. Claire Bennett, the physician overseeing the tent, glanced up briefly from her workstation before returning to her patient charts. Nobody expected anything interesting from the quiet single dad sitting near the supply station. Nobody expected history to be sitting in a folding chair with a coffee cup in one hand. Mason leaned against the table and laughed. "All right, now I have to know. What rank were you?" The tent remained busy for another second. Radios continued crackling. Boots shuffled across the temporary flooring. Someone dropped a pen. Then Ethan slowly raised his eyes and answered. And the moment the words left his mouth, the entire GP tent seemed to forget how to breathe. For a moment, nobody spoke. Sergeant Mason Reed stared at Ethan as if he had misheard him. One of the medics blinked twice. Another slowly lowered the clipboard in her hands. Even the constant hum of conversation inside the tent seemed to fade beneath a strange silence. Ethan did not look proud. He did not look embarrassed. He simply looked tired. The kind of tired that came from carrying responsibilities far heavier than rank or title. Then he lowered his eyes and returned to organizing paperwork as though nothing unusual had happened. The spell broke almost immediately. A radio crackled near the entrance. Someone called for a supply count. A patient laughed from across the tent. Life moved forward. But something had changed. Dr. Claire Bennett found herself looking at Ethan more than once during the next hour. She had spent years working around military personnel. She understood the difference between confidence and authority. Most people spent their careers trying to earn respect. Ethan carried it without asking for it. Yet there was no arrogance in him. No need to impress anyone. It bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Around 4 o'clock, Ethan finished his shift and stepped outside into the warm Carolina afternoon. The sunlight reflected off rows of temporary structures and military vehicles parked across the training grounds. Dust drifted through the air each time a truck passed by. Ethan unlocked an aging silver pickup truck that had clearly seen better years. The paint was fading. The tires were worn. The passenger side mirror had been repaired with careful precision rather than replaced. It was the kind of vehicle owned by someone who fixed problems instead of throwing money at them. He checked his watch and smiled faintly. School pickup. That was the part of his day that mattered most. 35 minutes later, he pulled into the parking lot of Jefferson Middle School. Students poured from the building carrying backpacks, sports equipment, and endless energy. Then he saw her. Lily Walker spotted the truck immediately. Her face lit up as she hurried toward him carrying a stack of books against her chest. At 12 years old, she had inherited her father's calm eyes and her mother's bright smile. Ethan stepped out and opened the passenger door before she even reached the truck. "How was your day?" he asked. "Science test," Lily answered. "I think I got an A." "Think?" Ethan asked. "Okay, probably an A." He laughed softly as she climbed inside. For the next several minutes, they talked about school projects, favorite teachers, and an upcoming field trip. Nothing extraordinary, nothing dramatic. Just a father and daughter sharing the ordinary moments that quietly build a life. As they drove home, Lily glanced toward him. "Did anything interesting happen at work today?" she asked. Ethan considered the question for a moment. The image of the frozen medical tent flashed briefly through his mind. Mason's surprised expression, Claire's confused stare. Then he smiled. "Not really." Lily narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "That means something happened." "Maybe. Dad, maybe somebody asked too many questions." Lily laughed. "And?" Ethan looked out at the road stretching ahead beneath the golden afternoon sun. "And sometimes people think they want an answer until they get one." He left it there. Because the truth was, Ethan had spent years trying to leave the past behind. He had no idea that before the week was over, the past would come looking for him instead. The next morning arrived wrapped in a blanket of gray clouds. A light mist hung over the training grounds as vehicles rolled through the gates and personnel reported for duty. Inside the GP tent, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead while medics prepared for another long day. Coffee steamed from paper cups. Computers hummed. Radios carried routine traffic from across the installation. To most people, it felt like an ordinary morning. To Dr. Claire Bennett, it did not. She had reviewed personnel files late into the evening after returning home. Not because she had been ordered to. Not because she needed the information. Curiosity had simply refused to leave her alone. Yet somehow, every search led nowhere. Ethan Walker existed in the system, but only in the way a shadow exists at sunset. Present, yet impossible to fully define. His current records were ordinary. Civilian contractor. Mechanical systems specialist. Single father. Emergency support certifications. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that explained the reaction his answer had created the previous day. Claire found herself looking toward the entrance every few minutes. When Ethan finally appeared carrying a worn thermos and a small tool bag, he looked exactly as he always did. Calm. Unhurried. Invisible. He nodded politely to a few people and moved toward a maintenance panel near the rear section of the tent. Not a single person would have guessed that he had become the most discussed subject on the installation overnight. Sergeant Mason Reed certainly had not forgotten. The moment he spotted Ethan, he walked over with two other Marines close behind. "Morning, Walker." Ethan glanced up from his tools. "Morning, Sergeant." Mason folded his arms. "You know, half the barracks spent last night arguing about you." Ethan tightened a bolt without looking up. "Sounds productive." One of the Marines laughed. Mason shook his head. "You seriously are not going to explain anything?" "Explain what?" Ethan asked. "That answer yesterday." Ethan finally looked at him. His expression remained friendly. "You asked a question. I answered it." The Marines exchanged frustrated looks. Claire watched the exchange from across the room. Part of her expected Ethan to enjoy the attention. Most people would. Instead, he seemed almost uncomfortable with it. As if every question dragged him toward a version of himself he no longer wanted to be. The morning continued. Patients arrived. Supplies were delivered. Routine inspections were completed. Around noon, a problem developed in one of the temporary storage units connected to the medical operation. Nothing serious at first. A communication relay began dropping signals intermittently. Technicians attempted quick fixes. The issue returned. More equipment started experiencing connection failures. Staff members became mildly frustrated but continued working. Ethan noticed the problem almost immediately. He listened quietly while several specialists debated possible causes. Nobody asked for his opinion. Nobody expected him to have one. He simply stood near the back of the group, observing. Claire noticed that too. There was something unusual about the way he watched. Not confused. Not concerned. Focused. Like someone reading a familiar map. Then one technician sighed loudly and threw up his hands. I have no idea what is causing this. Several people nodded in agreement. Ethan remained silent for another moment. Then he slowly stepped forward. And for the first time since arriving at the installation, he looked less like a contractor and more like a man who had spent years solving problems when failure was not an option. The technician looked up as Ethan approached the equipment rack. You see something? He asked. Ethan set down his tool bag and studied the blinking status lights for several seconds. Around him, conversations continued. Keyboards clicked. Radios hissed with static. The canvas walls of the GP tent fluttered gently beneath a steady afternoon breeze. Then Ethan pointed toward a junction panel mounted near the rear support frame. The relay is not failing, he said calmly. It is being overloaded. The technician frowned. We already checked that. Ethan nodded. You checked the relay. Did you check what was feeding it? A brief silence followed. Two specialists exchanged uncertain looks. One opened a diagnostic screen and began reviewing incoming traffic. 30 seconds later, his eyebrows lifted. Wait. He clicked through another menu. That cannot be right. Dr. Claire Bennett stepped closer. What is it? The specialist turned the monitor toward her. There is duplicate routing from 3 different temporary systems. They are all pushing traffic through the same channel. Claire looked back at Ethan. How did you know that? Ethan shrugged lightly. The delay pattern gave it away. The answer only created more questions. The technician quickly adjusted the routing assignments. Within moments, the warning indicators disappeared. Communication feeds stabilized. The intermittent failures stopped. A few people offered relieved smiles. Others stared at Ethan with growing curiosity. Mason Reed folded his arms. Okay, that was weird. Ethan picked up his tool bag. What was weird? Nobody figured that out all morning. Ethan smiled faintly. Then somebody had to. Before anyone could continue the conversation, a sharp tone suddenly echoed through the tent. Heads turned immediately. A second alert followed. Then a third. The room shifted from relaxed efficiency to focused urgency. A large-scale training scenario had just been activated across the installation. Medical teams would need to process a surge of simulated casualties arriving from multiple locations over the next several hours. It was only an exercise, but the standards were real. Coordination mattered. Accuracy mattered. Timing mattered. Claire immediately moved into action. Stations, everyone. Let us move. Personnel spread throughout the tent. Equipment carts rolled across temporary flooring. Folding tables were repositioned. Radios filled the air with overlapping updates. Outside, engines rumbled as transport vehicles began arriving according to the exercise schedule. For the first 20 minutes, everything ran smoothly. Then the volume increased. Additional units arrived ahead of schedule. New instructions came through from command. Resources had to be redistributed. Information started arriving faster than people could process it. The atmosphere inside the tent tightened. Nobody panicked, but everyone felt the pressure building. Claire moved from station to station, trying to maintain organization. Mason assisted where needed. Medics worked diligently. Yet the flow of information became increasingly difficult to manage. Ethan watched quietly from near the operations table. His expression remained unchanged. He listened to radio traffic. He observed movement patterns. He studied the growing confusion without saying a word. Then a coordinator looked up from a cluttered desk and sighed heavily. We are losing track of assignments. Another voice answered from across the room. I know. Everything is coming in at once. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Papers shifted beneath rushing hands. Radios overlapped with competing instructions. And standing quietly in the middle of the noise, Ethan Walker seemed to recognize something nobody else had yet seen. A problem was coming. Not a dangerous one. Not a dramatic one. But the kind of organizational collapse that could turn order into chaos if nobody took control soon enough. And for the first time all day, the calm in his eyes disappeared, replaced by the unmistakable focus of a man who had spent years carrying responsibility when everyone around him was looking for answers. The first person to notice the change was Dr. Claire Bennett. Ethan had not raised his voice. He had not stepped onto a platform. He had not announced himself. Yet somehow the center of gravity inside the tent shifted toward him. He walked calmly to the operations table and studied the assignment board for several seconds. Around him, Conversations overlapped. Radio operators requested updates. Coordinators searched for missing information. New arrivals continued appearing faster than assignments could be processed. Ethan placed one finger on the board. "Your intake teams are bottlenecking here," he said. A coordinator looked up. "What?" Ethan pointed again. "You have 3 stations feeding 1 reporting channel. Everything is stacking up in the same place." Another staff member frowned. "We already reorganized twice." "Then reorganize once more," Ethan replied. There was no frustration in his voice. No criticism. Just certainty. The coordinator hesitated. Claire noticed it immediately. People were not reacting to Ethan because he sounded important. They were reacting because he sounded right. Ethan continued. "Move Team 3 to the secondary lane. Route updates directly through logistics instead of operations. Separate incoming reports by category before they reach the desk." One of the radio operators blinked. "That would cut traffic in half." Ethan nodded. "Exactly." Claire stepped forward. "Do it." The order moved through the tent. Tables shifted. Assignments changed. Personnel adjusted positions. For a few minutes, the process felt awkward. Then something remarkable happened. The congestion began disappearing. Information flowed more smoothly. Waiting times dropped. Radio traffic became easier to manage. The entire operation seemed to exhale. Mason Reed watched the transformation with growing disbelief. 20 minutes earlier, everyone had been struggling to keep pace. Now the tent was functioning better than it had all day. He approached Ethan while a group of medics updated records nearby. "How did you see that so fast?" Ethan glanced toward the operations board. "Patterns." Mason laughed softly. "That is not an answer. It is the only answer I have." Mason shook his head. "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Making simple things sound mysterious." Ethan smiled faintly, but said nothing. The afternoon continued. Outside, clouds drifted across the Carolina sky. Sunlight occasionally slipped through gaps in the canvas walls, painting long golden lines across the floor. Inside the tent, the atmosphere felt different now. Not because Ethan demanded authority, because authority seemed to follow him naturally. People who had barely noticed him yesterday were now watching him carefully. Even Claire found herself studying the quiet contractor whenever he moved through the workspace. There was discipline in everything he did. Efficiency, patience, the habits of someone who had spent years carrying responsibility without seeking recognition for it. Then a young communications specialist hurried toward the operations desk, holding a tablet. "Dr. Bennett," he said, "you need to see this." Claire accepted the device and scanned the screen. Her expression changed immediately. "Where did you find this?" "Archived personnel records." Claire looked up sharply. Across the room, Ethan was helping reorganize supply inventories. Completely unaware of the conversation, the specialist lowered his voice. "I thought the name looked familiar." Claire stared at the screen again. Her pulse quickened, because for the first time, she was not looking at a contractor's file. She was looking at a fragment of a career so extraordinary that it explained everything and somehow raised even more questions than before. Claire stepped away from the operations desk and moved toward a quieter corner of the tent. The tablet felt strangely heavy in her hands. Around her, the exercise continued. Radios transmitted updates. Personnel moved between stations. The controlled rhythm of the operation had returned. Yet Claire barely noticed any of it. Her attention remained fixed on the personnel archive displayed on the screen. The file was incomplete. Large sections had been restricted. Entire assignments were missing. Dates appeared without descriptions. Locations had been removed. Even so, what remained was enough to leave her stunned. Ethan Walker had not simply served. He had led, not occasionally, repeatedly, specialized command appointments, strategic planning roles, advisory positions connected to operations that required extraordinary trust. The deeper she looked, the more impossible his current life seemed. A civilian contractor repairing equipment, a single father driving an aging pickup truck, a man who packed lunches and attended school meetings. The contrast made no sense. Unless it did. Claire looked across the tent toward Ethan. He was helping a supply clerk organize inventory boxes, smiling politely, listening more than speaking, looking completely at peace. It struck her then that perhaps he had not stepped down from something. Perhaps he had stepped toward something, toward his daughter, toward a quieter life, toward the kind of purpose that never appeared in official records. "Doctor." The communications specialist lowered his voice. There is more. Claire looked back at the screen. What do you mean? He pointed toward a notation near the bottom of the archive. This designation. Claire read it twice. Then a third time. Her eyes widened slightly. She had heard the title before. Most career military personnel had. It was associated with a leadership position so selective that very few people ever reached it. For several seconds, she simply stared. Meanwhile, Mason Reed had reached the end of his patience. Curiosity had been growing inside him for 2 days. Every answer created more questions. Every question somehow made Ethan more mysterious. By late afternoon, Mason finally walked across the tent and stopped beside him. Walker. Ethan looked up from the inventory sheet. Sergeant, can I ask you something? Ethan smiled faintly. You are going to anyway. A few nearby personnel chuckled. Mason grinned. Fair point. He glanced around at the growing audience. More people were paying attention now. Not openly. Just enough to listen. Yesterday, you gave us part of the answer. Ethan folded the inventory sheet and set it aside. Did I? You know you did. Mason shook his head. So let me ask again. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. A radio crackled near the entrance. Somewhere outside, a vehicle engine rumbled past. Then the tent grew strangely quiet. Mason met Ethan's eyes. What exactly was your rank? Ethan sat silently for a moment. Not annoyed. Not hesitant. Simply deciding whether the answer mattered. Finally he spoke. His voice was calm enough that several people almost missed the words. Colonel. A few heads turned. Mason blinked. Ethan continued. Joint Special Operations Command. The silence that followed felt different from before. Heavier. Deeper. Because this time everyone understood exactly what they had heard. And before a single person could respond, a senior officer stepped through the entrance of the GP tent, stopped abruptly upon seeing Ethan Walker, and stared as though he had just encountered someone he never expected to see again. The senior officer stopped so suddenly that the medic walking behind him nearly bumped into his shoulder. Conversations faded one by one. Heads turned. The officer's eyes remained locked on Ethan Walker. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then something happened that nobody inside the tent expected. The officer straightened instinctively. Not dramatically. Not for show. It was the natural reaction of someone recognizing a person whose reputation had long outgrown any title on paper. Sir, he said quietly. The words seemed to echo through the tent. Mason Reed blinked. Several medics exchanged confused looks. Claire Bennett felt her pulse quicken. Ethan sighed softly and shook his head. David, do not start. A faint smile appeared on the officer's face. Good to see you too, Colonel. The silence deepened. Mason looked from one man to the other. You know each other? The officer laughed once. Know each other? He glanced back at Ethan. Half the people in my generation studied decisions this man made. Ethan immediately looked uncomfortable. That is an exaggeration. No, sir. It really is not. The officer stepped closer and extended his hand. Ethan accepted it reluctantly. The gesture was simple, but the respect behind it was unmistakable. Claire watched every detail. She had spent enough years around leaders to recognize authentic admiration when she saw it. This was not politeness. This was something earned over decades. The officer introduced himself to the room. Brigadier General David Mercer. Several people straightened immediately. Even Mason stood a little taller. Yet the general seemed completely uninterested in his own rank. His attention remained focused on Ethan. I heard there was a contractor helping support the exercise, Mercer said. Nobody mentioned it was you. Ethan smiled faintly. That was the idea. A few people chuckled nervously. The general looked around the tent. You know, years ago I attended a leadership course where an instructor spent 3 hours analyzing one planning exercise. He pointed toward Ethan. This planning exercise. Mason stared. Seriously? Seriously. Mercer nodded. People still reference it. Ethan rubbed his forehead as though wishing the conversation would disappear. David. What? The general asked. They're going to find out eventually. Claire noticed something remarkable. The more praise Ethan received, the less comfortable he became. Most people chased recognition. Ethan seemed determined to escape it. That realization changed something in her. The records had impressed her. The respect from a general impressed her. But the humility impressed her most of all. Outside, evening sunlight stretched across the training grounds. Golden light filtered through the canvas walls of the GP tent. Dust drifted through the air like floating sparks. For a brief moment, everything felt strangely still. Then the general glanced toward the operations board and smiled. I should have known. Mason frowned. Known what? Mercer folded his arms. The reason this exercise suddenly started running smoothly. Several people looked toward Ethan. The inventory sheets in his hands. The reorganized workstations. The calm efficiency now flowing through the operation. The pieces finally began fitting together. And for the first time since meeting him, the people inside the tent stopped seeing Ethan Walker as a quiet contractor. They began seeing him as something far more difficult to define. A man who had once carried extraordinary responsibility and had somehow chosen a life where the most important title he held was simply Dad. The atmosphere inside the tent remained different long after Brigadier General Mercer stepped away to handle official business. Nobody returned to treating Ethan Walker like an ordinary contractor. They tried. They really did. But once a curtain has been pulled back, it becomes impossible to pretend it is still closed. Throughout the evening, small fragments of Ethan's past continued surfacing. Not because he shared them. In fact, he said almost nothing. The stories came from other people. A senior logistics officer recognized his name from an old leadership symposium. A communications specialist discovered archived commendations attached to projects that had become case studies. Even personnel who had never met him seemed to know pieces of the legend. Claire found herself listening from a distance. One story described a complex operation that had required coordination across multiple agencies and hundreds of personnel. Another mentioned a planning model still taught years later because of its efficiency. None of the stories focused on glory. None described dramatic heroics. They focused on responsibility, judgment, calm decision-making under pressure, the ability to bring order when confusion threatened to overwhelm everyone else. Claire finally approached Ethan while he packed equipment into storage containers near the rear of the tent. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Ethan smiled faintly. Apparently, that is becoming a popular activity. Claire laughed despite herself. "Why leave?" Ethan paused. The question lingered between them. Around them, evening settled across the installation. The golden light faded into softer shades of blue. Portable lights flickered on throughout the training grounds. Somewhere outside, a flag snapped gently in the wind. Ethan looked down at the storage container in his hands. "Most people assume success always means climbing higher," he said quietly. "More responsibility, more recognition, bigger titles." Claire waited. Ethan continued. "Sometimes success means knowing when enough is enough." He closed the container and secured the latch. "My daughter was growing up while I was always somewhere else." Claire said nothing. The answer explained more than any service record ever could. Ethan looked toward the tent entrance where the last rays of daylight were disappearing. "One day I realized that the people who respected me most were not the ones waiting at home." For a moment neither spoke. Then Claire nodded slowly. "You chose Lily." Ethan smiled. A real smile this time. Warm, proud, uncomplicated. Every time. Across the tent, Mason Reed had been listening without meaning to. The young Marine looked away, suddenly embarrassed by how wrong he had been. For 2 days he had been fascinated by Ethan's rank, his achievements, his reputation. Yet the man himself seemed to value none of those things nearly as much as a 12-year-old girl waiting for him after school. Mason finally walked over carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to Ethan. "For the record," he said awkwardly, "I think I owe you an apology." Ethan accepted the cup. "For what?" Mason stared at him. "You know exactly for what." Ethan chuckled softly. "Maybe." Mason shook his head. "I thought I was talking to a contractor." Ethan took a sip of coffee. "You were." Mason opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. Because somehow that answer felt completely true. And as the lights glowed beneath the canvas roof and the evening settled quietly around them, everyone inside the tent began understanding the same lesson. The most impressive thing about Ethan Walker was not the career he had left behind. It was the life he had chosen afterward. The exercise officially concluded the following afternoon. Vehicles departed. Temporary stations were dismantled. Equipment was packed into containers waiting for transport. The constant noise that had filled the installation for days slowly faded into a quieter rhythm. Yet long after the final reports were submitted, people were still talking about Ethan Walker. Not because he encouraged it. Not because he told stories. The truth was exactly the opposite. The less he said about himself, the more remarkable he seemed. As the GP tent prepared to close, Brigadier General Mercer returned one final time. Several personnel happened to be nearby when he stopped in front of Ethan. The conversation was brief, professional, respectful, but before leaving, the general extended his hand. "The Army was fortunate to have you," he said. Ethan shook his head with a faint smile. "The Army gave me more than I ever gave it." Mercer laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." Then he left. No speeches, no ceremony, no dramatic farewell, just quiet respect. Later that afternoon, Ethan loaded the last of his tools into the back of his aging pickup truck. The Carolina sky was clear now. Sunlight reflected off distant buildings while a gentle breeze carried the scent of cut grass across the installation. He was about to close the tailgate when he heard footsteps approaching. It was Mason Reed. The young Marine stopped beside the truck and stood awkwardly for a moment. "I never really understood something," Mason admitted. Ethan leaned against the truck. "What is that?" Mason glanced toward the training grounds. "If somebody had your career, your reputation, all that respect, why walk away?" Ethan looked toward the horizon for several seconds. "I did not walk away." Mason frowned. Ethan smiled. "I walked toward something better." At that exact moment, another vehicle pulled into the parking area. A 12-year-old girl jumped out before it had fully settled into a parking space. "Dad," Lily called. Ethan's face immediately changed. The seriousness disappeared. The quiet reserve vanished. In its place appeared something far more powerful. Joy. He opened his arms and Lily ran over, wrapping him in a hug. Mason watched silently. So did Claire Bennett, who had just exited the tent carrying a stack of folders. Nobody interrupted the moment. Nobody needed to. Lily looked up at her father. "Ready to go?" Ethan nodded. "Always." She noticed the small group standing nearby. "What?" she asked. Ethan chuckled. "Nothing." Claire smiled warmly. "Your father helped a lot of people this week." Lily looked completely unsurprised. "He does that." The simplicity of the answer settled over everyone like a final lesson. Not colonel, not strategist, not leader, not legend, just dad. Ethan climbed into the driver's seat while Lily settled beside him. The old pickup started with a familiar rumble. As they drove away, the people standing near the tent remained quiet. Mason was the first to speak. "You know," he said softly, "I thought the impressive part was his rank." Claire watched the truck disappear beyond the gate. Golden sunlight reflected across the windshield before it vanished from sight. Then she smiled. "No," she said, "that was never the impressive part." And for a moment, the entire group stood in silence. Not because they had been shocked, but because they finally understood that real dignity does not demand attention, real strength does not announce itself, and sometimes the greatest title a person can ever earn is the one waiting for them at home.